When I was little, I loved a series of books called The Magic Tree House. In every story, Jack and Annie, the two protagonists, would get whisked away to some faraway land. Usually it was somewhere in the past. They had these incredible adventures, and I became fascinated by history. I've now learned much more about the past, and as it turns out, books like Thanksgiving on Thursday, Mummies in the Morning, and Tonight on the Titanic actually leave out some key details about what everyday life used to be like. So this is a long shot, but if any of you know the author, Mary Pope Osborne, maybe you could pass along some ideas I have for more representative stories. Stories like tea time with typhoid fever, evenings without electricity or running water or central heating, strenuous manual labor at sunrise. See, despite what the Magic Tree House might have you believe, the past was a miserable time for most people. Life expectancy was a fraction of what it is today. The average diet was bland and unvaried. Workdays were long and grueling, and knowledge about health and hygiene was sparse. Around the mid-1800s, things began to change, fast. In his book, The Rise and Fall of American Growth, Robert Gordon describes the period from 1870 to 1970 as the special century. This era saw revolutions in virtually every facet of life across industrialized nations. Transportation, communication, food, clothes, shopping, homes, work, and health. This growth was unprecedented in all of human history. Pre-20th century life was such a primitive and uncomfortable baseline that these improvements amounted to an almost incomprehensible increase in the standard of living. These were low-hanging fruits of progress, and they were plucked with great speed and in great quantities. This era of rapid, transformative growth sets the scene for the first of two ideas I'd like to share with you today. It's a concept known as the stagnation hypothesis, and it explains how and why progress has slowed down since the special century. The second big idea is what we ought to do about this stagnation. We must invest more resources into studying how we can jumpstart our stalling growth. This is the goal of a new field of study called progress studies. In 2013, entrepreneur and investor Peter Thiel famously commented on the disappointing state of recent technological progress. We wanted flying cars, instead we got 140 characters. Of course, there has been some progress since 1970. It just hasn't been as broad or as life-changing as the previous decades. The special century upended every aspect of how we live, while more recent growth has been narrowly concentrated in information, communication, and entertainment, industries powered by the invention of the internet. Growth in other areas has slowed from an all-out sprint to more of a casual stroll. Modern improvements in healthcare, for example, should not be diminished, but they are far from the nearly 30 years of life expectancy that were added during the special century. Let's face it, a time traveler from the mid-1900s would be disappointed by 2022. They'd walk into one of our present-day homes and think to themselves, this actually looks pretty familiar. They'd get a job and learn that the 40-hour work week, which was a standard in 1940, is still the norm. They'd ask if we've built any lunar cities yet, and we'd tell them, no, it's actually been 50 years since we last set foot on the moon. This lackluster progress can't be explained by a lack of effort. Researchers and innovators are just as hardworking and creative as they used to be. In fact, we're investing more resources than ever into their work. The amount of scientific funding and the number of PhDs and publications are all growing exponentially. Unfortunately, however, the outputs from these investments aren't growing at the same rate. When asked to rank the importance of discoveries in their fields over time, top scientists produced fairly flat results. And productivity trends across healthcare, electronics, and agriculture all show a similar trend. The fact is, it's getting more difficult to innovate. We're using more inputs to achieve constant, and sometimes even less, progress over time. An economist would say we're seeing diminishing marginal returns. In everyday language, we're getting less bang for our buck. There are a few explanations for why this is. Our culture and our political and economic systems may not be as conducive to growth as they used to be. But equally important is the fact that in every field of study, the frontier of knowledge is as far out as it has ever been. Yet humans are born with an utter lack of knowledge, a mind that's a tabula rasa. And this means that aspiring innovators who want to push the boundaries of today's knowledge stock must spend increasing amounts of time and effort just getting to that frontier. The legendary physicist Paul Dirac called the 1920s a time when even second-rate physicists could make first-rate discoveries. The field was positively bursting with insights to be made. Now, it might be the case that even first-rate physicists struggle to make second-rate discoveries, since it takes decades to learn the foundational topics that bring them to the knowledge frontier. With all the low-hanging fruit picked, we have to expend more resources, climbing to higher branches, just to reap the same bushel of progress. The economist Benjamin Jones laid out this argument more formally, and with fewer fruit analogies, in a 2009 research paper titled "The Burden of Knowledge and the Death of the Renaissance Man." Jones analyzed data to show that society is trying to cope with the expanding knowledge frontier using three main strategies. We're spending more time in school, we're becoming more specialized, and we're relying more upon collaboration. Unfortunately, each of these has its limitations. Education is crucial, but more time spent in school means less time applying what we learn. More education is also not a sustainable solution. What happens when it takes an entire lifetime to reach the knowledge frontier for a particular topic? Increased specialization isn't ideal either. Being deeply specialized makes it nearly impossible to switch careers or fields of study, and it inhibits creativity, since specialists can't readily draw upon ideas from multiple domains. And while more collaboration sounds positive, it's also indicative of the growing limits on what a single motivated creator can accomplish. What's more, collaboration is often the result of a fortuitous chance encounter between individuals with complementary skills. Now, I love stories of serendipitous breakthroughs as much as anyone else. Alexander Fleming's famous accidental discovery of penicillin, for example. But do we really want to rely on fortune to determine whether we're able to cure diseases or invent new breakthrough technologies? So we find ourselves in the present, with progress becoming increasingly difficult and our instinctive responses proving insufficient. I don't need to tell you why this is problematic. Open any newspaper, and you'll be flooded with doom and gloom stories of the immense challenges facing our species, like poverty, climate change, and disease. And yet, despite all these challenges, I'm actually quite hopeful. You see, the growing difficulty of extending the knowledge frontier presents an incredible opportunity for humanity. It's exposed the fact that we've invested frightfully little in the systematic study of human progress. Progress Studies seeks to remedy this. The young field employs lessons from history, economics, politics, and more niche areas like organizational studies. What distinguishes Progress Studies from these related subjects is that it is prescriptive and not just descriptive. Some say the fields it draws upon are like anatomy, and Progress Studies is like medicine. It's an applied social science that takes insights about how the complex body of our society works and uses them to recommend tangible actions for maximizing development. This is important because we can't cure stagnation with more explanation. What we need is a treatment, an intervention, a dose of carefully prescribed reform to revive our past growth. Think for a moment about the most productive societies throughout history. Ancient Greece, Renaissance Florence, Edinburgh during the Scottish Enlightenment, more recently, Silicon Valley. We tend to think of these as exogenous events. They just happen to happen. But what if we could make them happen? What if we could plan and strategize and engineer these types of societies? Progress Studies offers us a framework to do just that. Although it's in its early days, Progress Studies already has much to say about addressing the Great Stagnation. It suggests we can make improvements to our culture and to our institutions and systems. In terms of culture, we must first recognize that it is possible to deliberately create progress. Great ideas don't have to just fall from the sky, like the apocryphal apple that hit Newton on the head. Innovation isn't some fickle light bulb that randomly blinks on above a lucky genius. It's an outcome for which we can strategically optimize. If we regard progress as arbitrary or unachievable, we risk becoming a cynical society with a zero-sum mindset. If there's no progress to be made, then my gain must be your loss, and vice versa. But when we understand that we have agency, that we can shape our future rather than letting it shape us, when we adopt a positive-sum mindset of enlightened invention, then we become doers and builders and creators. You see, societies that believe they can make progress and societies that don't are both usually right. We must also address the growing backlash against progress. There are those who contend it does more harm than good, pointing to negative repercussions like climate change and technology's pernicious impacts on our privacy and mental health. These are significant, alarming drawbacks. But this is no reason to shun progress. Imagine if our Paleolithic ancestors had rejected fire as too dangerous the first time they got burned. Where progress instigates problems, it also offers solutions. Carbon credits, advanced renewables, geoengineering, lab-cultivated meat. The answer to climate change is innovation. Studying progress lets us learn from both our past successes and mistakes so that we can avoid getting burned again as we take full advantage of powerful technologies like AI and bioengineering. And then we have our institutions. Here's a thought experiment for you. If we could entirely rebuild our institutions from the ground up, do you think we'd design them to be exactly as they are right now? If the answer is no, then we ought to proactively make those improvements. Let's scrutinize our education system. Early proponents of progress studies have raised the alarm on how little we're experimenting in our schools. We should be getting creative with our classroom structures and curricula, and making sure educators are compensated with the salaries and the prestige that draw the best and brightest to teaching. Let's review current funding mechanisms. The private sector is notorious for underinvesting in risky, long-term projects, like startups working on biotech and clean energy. Meanwhile, public funding for research is woefully understudied and should be focusing more on risk-taking and researcher autonomy. Let's weigh the costs and benefits of our current regulations. Are we doing enough to incentivize research and development? Are all of our laws up to date, or is our regulatory state burdened with red tape? Now, changes to our institutions are often contentious. So let me be clear, I'm not advocating for any specific proposals. I'm advocating for exploration. I'm advocating for humility, open-mindedness, and courage. Humility, to acknowledge that our current institutions may be suboptimal. Open-mindedness, to thoughtfully consider alternatives. And courage, to experiment with those alternatives, to see if they might work better. Improving our ability to generate progress will benefit everyone, but it also requires everyone's participation. Business leaders, policymakers, educators, students, parents, we all have a role to play in reshaping our society so that we can innovate on how we innovate. Studying progress will make us all more informed citizens and more conscientious champions of growth. And at the very least, it will make us all more appreciative beneficiaries of the fruits of human progress that we often take for granted. Thank you.